Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. Mounts Bay, Cornwall, August. Agnes Pender, 19 years of age, awakens to her cottage door shattering inward. Two men seize her from her bed by the hair. Beyond the threshold, the village of Mousehole blazes orange against the darkness. She hears her mother scream somewhere in the chaos. That voice will never reach her ears again. Agnes is hurled into a longboat, alongside 11 other women from her village. Their wrists are lashed with rope so severely that her fingers lose sensation within minutes. The men converse in a tongue she cannot comprehend. One brandishes a curved blade at the throat of a girl attempting to rise. The girl is 14. She freezes. By sunrise, Agnes finds herself aboard a vessel with over 60 Cornish prisoners. The youngest is 9. The eldest is 43. The men have been segregated and shackled below deck. The women are confined to a cramped hold reeking of tar and human filth. When the English coastline vanishes beyond the horizon, one woman begins praying aloud. A Corsair silences her with the back of his hand. Agnes will endure the next 3 weeks on this vessel. She will witness 4 women perish from thirst and disease before they reach the African shore. She will be stripped, examined, and sold in a marketplace where buyers inspect her teeth like livestock. She will be acquired by a merchant who speaks no English and transported to a house where she will remain for the next 22 years. She will bear children she is forbidden to keep. She will forget the sound of her own mother's voice. She will die at 41, never having glimpsed England again. This is the account of what happened to 400 English women taken from Cornwall in the summer raids of 1695. And it is an account that England has tried desperately to forget. Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where we unearth the stories buried beneath centuries of silence. Stories of ordinary people who vanished into a system designed to erase them completely. Subscribe and leave a like if you believe these stories deserve to be told. Because what the Barbary Corsairs inflicted upon the women of Cornwall was not random violence. It was an industry, and it operated for over 3 centuries. The Barbary coast stretched from Morocco to Libya. Its ports functioned as independent states ruled by Corsair captains who owed nominal allegiance to the Ottoman Empire but answered to no one. Algiers alone housed over 25,000 Christian captives. By 1620, Salé, Tunis, and Tripoli held thousands more. These were not random pirates. They were a military-industrial complex built entirely on human trafficking, and their reach extended far beyond the Mediterranean. In 1595, a Barbary fleet appeared off the coast of Cornwall for the first time. The English had no warning. The Corsairs landed at Penzance, burned the town, and took 80 captives in a single night. England was stunned. The raiders had sailed over 2,000 miles through hostile waters to reach a coastline that considered itself untouchable. It would not be the last time. Elizabeth Trenwith was 34 years old when the Corsairs came to Loo in Igsight-Synod-Vine-Syke. She had 3 children under the age of 10. Her husband Thomas was a fisherman who happened to be at sea that morning. When he returned that evening, his cottage was ash. His wife and all 3 children were gone. He spent the next 11 years attempting to ransom them. He mortgaged his boat, his house, and borrowed from every merchant in Cornwall. He raised £120. It was not enough. Elizabeth was valued at £180. The children were sold separately before he could make contact. Thomas Trenwith died in 1626 without ever learning what happened to his family. The economics of Barbary slavery were precise. A healthy young woman between 15 and 25 fetched between £100 and £200 at auction. That is roughly £30,000 in modern currency. A skilled tradesman might earn £8 per year. A ransom demanded triple the purchase price. The mathematics were designed to make rescue impossible for anyone except the wealthy. The Corsairs who raided Cornwall and Penzance were not Moors or Turks. Their leader was a man named Murad Reis, born Jan Jansoen in the Dutch city of Haarlem. He had been a legitimate privateer before his capture and conversion to Islam. Now he commanded a fleet operating out of Salé in Morocco. Under his direction, Barbary ships reached Iceland in 1667, taking over 400 captives from a single village. Cornwall was closer and softer. The fishing villages had no walls, no cannons, no militia. They were harvested like crops. Mary Walcott was 16 when Murad Reis's men pulled her from her father's boat in Penzance harbor. She watched her father take a sword through the stomach when he tried to hold onto her arm. His body went into the water. Mary went into the hold. She would later describe the voyage in a letter smuggled to England through a Franciscan friar. The women were kept in darkness for 23 days. They were fed once daily. They were not permitted to speak. When one woman died on the 14th day, her body remained in the hold for 3 more days before the Corsairs removed it. The English government knew the raids were coming. Merchants in the Mediterranean had reported increased Barbary activity throughout Saxodon. The mayor of Penzance had written to London requesting coastal defences. His letter went unanswered. When the raids finally came, the response was silence. Parliament debated. The navy claimed insufficient ships. Charles I was consumed by conflicts with France and Spain. The women of Cornwall were abandoned to their fate. Official English records claimed 60 taken in the Ilse-Hedvine of raids. Parish records tell a different story. Mousehole alone lost 47 inhabitants in a single night. Penzance lost over 60. Loo, Fowey, and smaller fishing hamlets along the coast added dozens more, when later historians compiled the full accounting from church registers, probate records, and family testimonies. The number exceeded 400. Over half were women and children. The discrepancy exists because England did not want to admit the scale of its failure. The journey from Cornwall to the Barbary coast took between 2 and 4 weeks depending on weather. Captives were kept below deck in holds designed for cargo. The space allotted per person was roughly 6 feet by 2 feet. There was no standing. There was no privacy. Waste accumulated where people lay. Fresh water was rationed to 1 cup a day. Bread was distributed every second morning. Many captives arrived at their destination already weakened by dysentery and dehydration. Agnes Pender watched the African coast appear through a gap in the deck planking on September 8th. The ship anchored at Salé, Morocco. The women were brought up into sunlight they had not seen in 22 days. Their eyes burned. Their legs could barely support them. They were hosed down with seawater and made to stand in a line while local merchants examined them. Agnes would later tell the ransom negotiator that she did not feel human in that moment. She felt like a horse at market. The Badistan was the slave market of Algiers. Salé had its own version. Buyers walked between captives, inspecting teeth, examining hands for signs of labor, asking questions through translators. Women under 25 were separated immediately. They commanded the highest prices. Their destinations were typically domestic service or the household harems of wealthy merchants. The term used was concubine. The reality was a life of permanent sexual availability with no legal protections and no possibility of refusal. Catherine Trelawney was 21 when she entered the household of a textile merchant in Algiers. She had been a fisherman's daughter in Fowey. Now she was one of 4 women serving a man whose name she would never be permitted to speak aloud. Her duties began before dawn and ended after midnight. She cleaned, she cooked, she served. At night, she was summoned. She bore 2 children in 4 years. Both were taken from her within weeks of birth. She was not permitted to nurse them. She was not permitted to name them. She was told they were being raised as Muslims and would never know her. The legal status of a slave in Barbary society was absolute property. A master could sell, gift, or dispose of his slaves at will. The children of female slaves automatically became the property of the master, not the mother. Conversion to Islam provided certain protections but did not guarantee freedom. A converted slave who fled was still subject to recapture. A converted slave who refused her master was still subject to punishment. The system was airtight. Mary Walcott's letter to England described what happened to women who resisted. One captive from the Cornwall raids refused to enter her assigned household. She was beaten with rods until she complied. Another woman attempted escape in her 2nd year. She was caught within a day. Her punishment was administered publicly. Her feet were beaten until the bones cracked. She never walked properly again. Mary wrote that after witnessing this, no other woman from the Cornwall group attempted escape. The lesson had been taught. The household hierarchy placed European slaves at the bottom. Above them were African slaves, then converted Muslims, then free servants, then family members. A Cornish woman in a Barbary household had no rank, no recourse, and no voice. If another servant accused her of theft, she was punished without investigation. If her master wished to sell her, she went. The average household slave was sold 3 to 4 times during her captivity. Each sale meant a new city, new language, new master, new rules. Elizabeth Trenwith spent her first 2 years in Salé. She was then sold to a buyer from Algiers. Her children had been separated from her on the auction block. Her 9-year-old son was purchased by a shipyard owner and put to work caulking hulls. Her 7-year-old daughter was taken inland to a household Elizabeth would never locate. Her youngest, a boy of 5, was selected for conversion and military training. He would eventually serve as a Janissary soldier. He would forget his mother's face within 3 years. The average survival rate for captives in their first year was approximately 70%. Disease, violence, and suicide claimed the rest. Dysentery was endemic. Beatings for minor infractions were standard. Some women chose not to continue. The records from Franciscan friars who operated in Barbary, as ransom negotiators described finding captives who had stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped responding to their own names. The term used was consumed by despair. Agnes Pender was purchased by a merchant named Hassan ibn Yusuf. He owned a house in Salé with 11 rooms. Agnes slept on a mat in a storeroom with 2 other women. One was English, taken from a ship near Gibraltar. One was Spanish, from a raid on the Andalusian coast. They communicated in broken gestures. They were not permitted to speak their own languages when their master was present. Within a year, Agnes found herself dreaming in Arabic. The daily routine was 17 hours of labor. Women rose before dawn to prepare meals. They cleaned, they washed, they hauled water from the well, they served their master's meals in silence, they attended to his guests. When night came, they were available for whatever purpose the master chose. There was no concept of rest days. There was no concept of privacy. Even bathing was supervised to prevent escape attempts. The women were never truly alone. Think about what this meant. A woman from a fishing village in Cornwall who had grown up speaking English, attending church, knowing every family in her community taken in the night, shipped across an ocean, sold to a stranger, made to serve in ways she could never have imagined, for year after year after year. How long could you have held onto your identity? Let us know in the comments. Catherine Trelawney made a choice in her 3rd year of captivity. She converted to Islam. Conversion did not bring freedom, but it brought marginally better treatment. Converted slaves were less likely to be sold. They could own small amounts of property. They could marry, though only with their master's permission. Catherine calculated that survival was more important than faith. She would live another 34 years in Algiers, never once attempting escape. The ransom system existed, but it was designed to fail. A master set the price. The price was always beyond the captive's known resources. Families in England received letters demanding £200, £300, £400 for relatives who had earned £8 a year. The Church of England collected ransom funds from parish donations. Between 1620 and 1640, the Church raised approximately £6,000, enough to ransom 30 captives out of an estimated 20,000 being held. The mathematics told the truth. Almost no one was coming home. Mary Walcott's father had been killed in front of her. Her mother had died the previous winter. She had no family with resources to ransom her. Her letter to England was addressed to her uncle, a carpenter in Plymouth. She asked him to pray for her. She asked him to remember her. She did not ask for rescue. She knew the numbers. Her uncle kept the letter in a family Bible. It was discovered in 1893 when the Bible was donated to a Plymouth church. The children taken from Cornwall faced a different kind of erasure. Boys under 12 were often selected for the Devshirme system. This was forced conversion followed by military training. The boys were given new names, new clothes, new identities. They were forbidden from speaking English. They were forbidden from discussing their origins. Within 5 years, most had forgotten their birth families entirely. Some rose to positions of significant power in Barbary military hierarchies. They became the very raiders who would take future English captives. Girls under 12 entered household service immediately but were often earmarked for future purposes. They were trained in domestic skills, language, deportment. When they reached 14 or 15, they were married to men chosen by their masters. The marriages were legal under Islamic law but recognized no consent from the bride. The girls became wives to strangers who had purchased them as children. Their children would be Muslim, would speak Arabic, would never know their mothers had once been English. Agnes Pender bore her first child in 1698. She was 22 years old. The child was a girl. Agnes was permitted to nurse her for 3 weeks before the infant was taken to be raised by another household. Agnes would bear 3 more children over the next decade. She was permitted to know the fate of none of them. When she asked questions, she was told that slaves do not have children. Slaves produce property. The women who survived longest were those who accepted their situation completely. They learned Arabic fluently. They converted sincerely. They performed their duties without resistance. Some eventually earned enough trust to manage other slaves. A handful were granted freedom upon their master's death, as Islamic law encouraged. But freedom in Algiers at age 45 with no money, no family, and no way home was not truly freedom. It was abandonment. The raids on Cornwall continued for another century. 1625 was not an anomaly. It was the beginning of an escalation. In 1631, Murad Reis raided Baltimore, Ireland, taking 237 captives from a village of similar size to Mousehole. In 1640, Corsairs attacked the Channel Islands. In 1655, they reached as far as Newfoundland. The Atlantic slave trade is remembered. The Barbary slave trade is largely forgotten. Parliament eventually responded, but not with rescue. In high 1687, they authorized the collection of ship money to build a fleet capable of protecting English coasts. The fleet took 8 years to complete. By then, thousands more had been taken. The Navy conducted occasional punitive raids on Barbary ports. They freed small numbers of captives. They never addressed the systemic scale of the trade. The majority of those taken from Cornwall died as slaves in Africa. Elizabeth Trenwith's fate remains uncertain. Her husband Thomas tracked her sail from Salé to Algiers through merchants who dealt in both textiles and human cargo. He located a name in a household but could not raise the ransom. His letters to that household went unanswered. After his death in 1626, no one continued the search. Elizabeth may have lived another decade. She may have died within months of his final letter. The records simply end. Catherine Trelawney outlived most of her fellow captives. Her conversion and her compliance extended her life to nearly 60 years. When her master died in 1648, he freed her in his will. She was 44. She had been a slave for 23 years. Freedom meant she could no longer be sold. It did not mean passage home. She lived in Algiers for another 15 years as a free Muslim woman. She never attempted to contact anyone in England. What would she have said? Who would have remembered her? The children of the Cornwall captives present the deepest erasure. Boys raised as janissaries served in campaigns across the Mediterranean. Some participated in raids that captured new English victims. They did not know they were taking people from the nation of their birth. They did not know they had once been English themselves. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Victims became perpetrators, became recruiters of new victims. Mary Walcott's letter contains one specific detail that haunts historians. She mentions a girl from Loo named Joan who was 8 years old when taken. Joan was purchased separately and Mary never saw her again. But 3 years later, Mary encountered a young servant in her master's household who spoke broken English phrases. The girl did not recognize the language as her own. She repeated the words like sounds without meaning. She had been in Barbary since age 8. She was now 11. She had already forgotten. The total number of Europeans taken by Barbary Corsairs between 1200 and 1800 is estimated at over 1 million. English captives represented a fraction of this number, perhaps 60,000 across 3 centuries. But for the fishing villages of Cornwall, the impact was catastrophic. Entire family lines ended. Entire communities emptied. The psychological scar lasted generations. Coastal populations slept with one eye open for the next 100 years. Ransom efforts continued sporadically throughout the 17th century. The Trinitarian Order, a Catholic religious group dedicated to freeing Christian slaves, negotiated releases when funds were available. Between 1660 and 1700, they ransomed approximately 3,000 English captives, but the ransomed represented less than 5% of those taken. And ransomed captives returned to find their families gone, their properties sold, their communities shattered. Rescue was not restoration. Agnes Pender was never ransomed. Her husband had died before the raid. Her parents had died in the raid itself. She had no siblings with resources. She had no one in England who knew her current location. She existed in the records only as a name on a parish register, and a number on a sale document discovered centuries later in Moroccan archives. Her life between 1647 and her death in 1647 exists in fragments. Her master's household records show a servant named Aisha who was English-born. This is believed to be Agnes under her converted name. The final decades of the Barbary slave trade saw diplomatic pressure begin to have effect. European navies grew stronger. Mediterranean commerce demanded safer routes. In 1816, a combined British and Dutch fleet bombarded Algiers and forced the release of over 3,000 captives. In 1830, France invaded Algeria and ended Corsair operations there permanently. But these victories came 200 years too late for the women of Cornwall. Modern genetics has occasionally intersected with this history. Researchers studying North African populations have identified European maternal lineages appearing suddenly in the 17th century. These are the genetic traces of captive women who bore children in Barbary households. Their descendants number in the thousands. They live in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. They do not know they carry Cornish blood. They do not know their great-great-great-great-grandmothers were taken from fishing villages by men with curved swords in the summer of 1600. The villages themselves rebuilt. Mousehole still exists. Penzance still exists. But walk through these towns today, and you will find no memorial to the 400, no plaque on a harbor wall, no statue in a churchyard. The Barbary raids have been erased from local memory as thoroughly as the women were erased from their families. Agnes Pender was 19 years old when they dragged her from her cottage in Mousehole. She was 41 when she died in a house in Salé that she was never permitted to leave. During those 22 years, she never saw England again. She never learned what happened to her mother, who died in the raid. She never spoke her own language except in whispers with other captives who remembered. She bore 4 children. She was permitted to hold none of them. The sale document records her price as £140. The household inventory records her as property alongside furniture, textiles, and livestock. Her death is noted in a single line. No cause, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that she had once been a fisherman's daughter who knew the tides and the names of every family in her village and the sound of English church bells on Sunday mornings. 400 women shared versions of this story. 400 women were stripped from their lives in a single summer and shipped to a continent where no one knew their names. Some survived decades. Some died within months. All of them were erased from the history that England preferred to tell about itself. A maritime nation that ruled the seas. A Protestant stronghold that protected its people. A civilization that did not lose its daughters to slave markets in Africa. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we refuse to let these stories remain buried. The stones of Mousehole Harbor are the same stones Agnes walked across on her last night in England. The water is the same water. The wind carries the same salt. But the women are gone. Their stories are gone, and until someone speaks their names, they remain gone. That's why we're here, to speak their names, to tell their stories, to ensure that history remembers what it tried so hard to forget. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe to Crimson Legacy Historians, and in the comments below tell us what other forgotten histories deserve to be brought to light. Because every voice silenced by time deserves to be heard again.